Right. Just had to stop here just to see how beautiful Mike looks in this photograph.
I was gonna say, let's edit me out and just keep it on. You would make your face would make a great beverage coaster. I just realized that.
Yeah, I've grown a COVID beard, so I look a little different these days. All right. So I am the Director of Custom Application Development and Integration at GSI. I've been here for 10 years, and I've been doing this consulting for 30 years. And I have seen lots and lots of things in my career as a consultant, and I'm going to kind of talk about what we have done in the past, but I'm going to stick to just the last few years because we don't need to really go back a whole decade ago. But what I think the reason why everybody's here is that they want to understand how integrations work, how you want to be able to reduce the needs of your employees to hand enter data, or that you put in some sort of integration that has failed. And I kind of lay it out as kind of a marriage, because as you can see by our beautiful graphics here, you could be happy reading books together and sharing flowers and walking the dog and everybody's super happy, but that's not really how integrations work, because once they've been completed, things change, and they always do. Security comes in, the ports that you use get closed up. The format from the one system changes and breaks it. The database structures change. The server names change. So it is something that you have to keep up to date. You have to work on constantly in order for them to stay current. So you don't get a surprise at month end where you're missing $5 million of Amazon orders that the integration broke and nobody noticed. So you got to make sure that there's visibility in the integration, that people understand the integration, that the systems that support it are up to date. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So at the end, you can be sitting here dancing with your significant other and enjoying your integration life to the best you can. So we're going to go over just the basic types of integration that you can have. There's the application where you can take best of breed software and integrate it with your core system. So if you have JD Edwards and you dislike the HR module, you can go and grab another vendor's HR model and integrate with it. The systems then become seamless. You can create what are microservices, which are APIs that you can then give out to your vendors or your customers that allow them to use your system without having to build something custom every time. And there's lots of pluses and minuses for that, but we'll go into that in a little bit. Then there's the B2B stuff where you're dealing with your vendors directly to bring in data that you need for your core systems. And most of the stuff we're going to discuss in this webinar are going to be application integrations, by the way, but I thought that it's important to understand the rest of them. We have big data where you need to be able to transfer big chunks of data across the internet. You have platform integration. You have IoT devices, the Internet of Things, where you have computer chips, sensors that are feeding data into whatever system you needed. If you have a tractor that needs maintenance after operating for 500 hours, it can send a notification that that's happened, and then it'll automatically schedule a service request to go out and do the maintenance all behind the scenes. You don't have anybody that has to do that. We talked about data, then there's the big data, which has a whole slew of issues around it. But again, that's something that we're not going to talk too much about in this set of slides. You have multi-cloud, where you need to have your cloud applications communicate with each other. And then you just have your basic event streams, where you need to be able to gather data at a stream. But the integrations we're going to talk about right now are going to be the four main ones that most enterprises need. Direct file importation, which we won't talk too much about because that's fairly basic. And we'll talk about point-to-point, IPAS, and enterprise service bus. Now the point-to-point we'll go through, and with the IPAS and enterprise service bus, we'll talk about case studies that we have done, the pluses and minuses, and lessons learned from each one of them. But the basic file import, if you're a JD Edwards customer, you can bring files in and drop them in the Z file process to process data. Some of the older systems just had an import function where you could grab a file from, if you're doing bank reconciliation, you go grab the file from the bank and run it through, and it'll reconcile your data. But those things, if they're very simple and they work well, that's fine. But the main problem that you have with those is that they have to be formatted correctly for the import to happen. And if anybody changes it, the imports fail, and usually they fail silently. Somebody has to really keep an eye out on those things to make sure that they get processed correctly. And if you just have one or two files that you need to do, that's fine. But once you start getting into larger and larger file formats and more integrations, that becomes more and more difficult to maintain. But let's talk now about point-to-point integrations, which if most of you guys are probably doing these, where you have an internal staff or some consultants come in and write a set of APIs for your system that can grab data from your vendors or the third-party systems that you're using that you want to integrate with. And as you can kind of see from this diagram, that the more and more of these you do, the more complicated your integrations become. The amount of web services that you have to build becomes kind of unattainable once you get past 50 of these things. Then it just becomes a nightmare. We have a current customer, which I'll kind of go over in a minute, where we have something like 97 of these that we've had to put together, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the idea being that the data comes in, has to be transformed somewhere. And usually that's in the web service. So the data comes in, it's got field formats, you got to do your data mapping. There's lots of different ways to do that, but then you run the process and spit it up, handle it. All the error handling needs to be built into these web services. And the making sure that people check out the logs or emails go out to the right people becomes super important. Otherwise, like the worst thing that happens is when these things fail silently. You have to pay a lot of attention to the unhappy path. The happy path means everything works fine. Unhappy path means something broke it. How do you figure out what broke it? How are you going to go back and fix it? And can you rerun it to make it catch up? So there are a whole slew of these kind of problems that you run into with these point-to-point integrations, right? They're relatively fast and easy to put together if you've got the right framework, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. They're much more flexible than the basic file format. If you built your own APIs, and they're relatively low cost. There's no third-party software that you have to purchase in order to make this stuff run. And APIs are huge these days, so there's tons and tons of open source frameworks that you can bring in to help you better design your APIs. Back to what the cons are. I mean, we talked a little bit about scalability. They can kind of get out of hand, especially when you're doing your data mapping inside your services, which means that each one of your vendors may need its own API, its own service. And that becomes just kind of a nightmare. And one of the things that I run into all the time is these, what I call zombie implementations, where the people that built them are no longer with the organization and everybody is terrified of touching them. And that happens all the time. They weren't well documented. Decisions were made in these complex systems that people don't really understand. And sometimes they were developed by one good developer, and then some subpar developers made modifications to it and broke it. And then you have other good developers come in and they fix it, but not quite well enough, and it ends up becoming a nightmare. I ran into a customer who on one set of methods had fixed it, another method broke it, and then somebody came around and built another method that fixed it again. So, understanding how and why these integrations were put together are huge. And that brings us to documentation, which everybody hates doing, but is super important here, and kind of get into that in the next slide. And then you can overload these services if you don't make sure that you stress test them beforehand. And you have to have a good design on fault tolerance. You have to have failover capabilities. Where are you going to do that? Are you going to do that at the firewall level? You have to bring in your network engineers to help with that. So there's a whole lot of and security as well, things that you have to take in consideration for. So I'll talk a little bit about this one integration that we are currently working on. It is a utility company that had bought the JD Edwards World product, which ran on an AS400 running RPG. So any of you guys that know what that is, you've probably been in this business as long as I have, because it is ancient technology. But they have millions of customers, and they had to keep some of their custom built systems in JD Edwards in the World product for another 2 years before they can migrate off of it. So we originally came in, the JD Edwards World product had no APIs whatsoever. So we had to build all of them custom. And we did that about 10 years ago. And then they switched one of their front end self-help front end, the self-service, where customers can check their bill, pay their bills, they can turn on and off their utility. So they bought another vendor, and they wanted us to come in and redo it because we're the only ones that understood how to do it, which is kind of a scary thing. But when we look back at it, they really had no idea how any of this stuff worked. So I tried to convince them to go with using something like Boomi or one of the IPAS systems, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they said no, they just wanted to go point to point. So what we ended up doing, we built this thing in Java, and we used a product called Swagger, which if any of you guys are going to be developing any APIs, any REST APIs, I highly, highly, highly recommend using Swagger. It's an open source tool set. It's based on the Open API 3 protocols that allow you to build web services, but they also will self-document themselves. So at the end of this of your cycle, you'll end up with the Swagger IO components that allow you to be able to look at your APIs to see what the payload looks like, to see what parameters get sent in, why they get sent in, what are optional, what are required. All of that makes it so much easier. So anybody that needs to use the API in the future can just go to that screen, look at it, and it's laid out right there for you. If you understand what your APIs are going to look like, you can bring in the data, and it will generate your base classes for you. So you can then stick the business logic in where you want, but it'll actually build the majority of your scaffolding for your objects, which is super helpful. It can also be used if you put bogus data in there that the other partner that you're integrating with can start making calls and work on their system while you're working on your system. It'll be bogus data, but they can make those calls and make sure that the data gets transferred back to them. Oh, sorry, I'm got a little bit of a cold here, so I may be coughing. And it just makes developing the application much easier, because the biggest problem that you run into is people not understanding how your APIs work. They don't understand how the system works in the back end, and the documentation gets way out of whack within 6 months of going live with something. With Swagger, every time you make a modification, it forces you to make the changes in the API so that everything matches. And then I also force everyone to document the heck out of their code. One thing I despise is when I go and look at somebody's integration and they haven't actually commented anything. It's just stream of consciousness. Now, some of we're a big agile users, and we do code reviews. So that's one of the things that I require our guys to do, is just to make sure there is as much green code comments as there is actual code, so people understand how the code works. So when you have to make modifications later, you do that. But so what you're seeing is these are custom APIs that you have to build because you have a system that doesn't have any good APIs, or you have a custom built application that's in your enterprise that you need to present that data to somebody else or grab data from someone. So that's why all this stuff needs to be done custom, but you really want to pay attention to how you put it together using the correct framework, and you'll have a lot better chance of success. Now, the second one is when you use an IPAS package like Boomi, Zapier. There's a whole slew of third-party middleware tools that do your integration for you. And what's really nice about these is that a lot of them have connectors already built, so you don't have to build anything. If you want to grab something from Amazon and you want to stick it into NetSuite, there's connectors already built. You just snap them together. I mean, it's a little harder than just snapping them together, but you can connect them quite easily. Then you can build in more complex workflows, and I'll kind of get into that in a minute when I kind of go over the case study. And if you use a tool like that, it's a little easier to find developers that understand. If you want to find a Boomi person, that's not super difficult. And all of your integrations are upfront in a nice data workflow that you can look at and you can see it, and it's self-documenting, and it's just block after block of business logic. You can take all your data mapping out of your two applications, and that gets stuck in the software. So your data mappings are there. So if you're dealing with Concur, which does invoicing, and they change the name of a field, you can easily just go in here and change it inside of your IPAS software. It's very visible, and you can build in lots of if-then statements within the tool. It already comes with its own security, so you can use OAuth 2, you can use whatever security model you want, without having to write it from scratch, where you would have to do if you're doing more of a point-to-point thing, where you'd have to stick that security layer in your application. It has good access to for anybody to work in development. And again, the larger systems have all these prepackaged APIs, which are super helpful in making it more simple to integrate these things with. And I guess the cons are there are so many IPAS vendors out there. Picking the right one probably is based on what your systems that need to get integrated are. I mean, I keep on bringing up Boomi because that's our preferred one. But we have used Zapier, Jitterbit, some of the other ones based upon what the customer's needs are. Like a Jitterbit and Zapier are all fairly simple and inexpensive to use, but they don't do the really nice data workflows like something like Boomi does. And you know, you do have to pay attention to how it's running. You know, what we did in our last IPAS implementation, which I'll talk about in the next slide. We built in our own. We built we did it in Boomi, and the code chunks are called atoms. We built our own logger atom that we use on all our customers, so it kind of creates logs for issues that we run into our workflows, and then also transmit the data over to the correct people if something fails. Yeah. But you know, I mean, I guess security is security, whether it's point-to-point or IPAS. The security level still needs to be maintained. The application software package will do that for you up to a point, but you still have to keep a good close eye on that just to make sure. So we just did a project where it was an invoicing software package that needed to connect to JD Edwards, another JD Edwards implementation. And they had a vendor that came in and did it, and they were fairly new to Boomi, which is the software package that we used. And they got it to work about 80% of the time, which isn't really good enough when you're talking about invoices, right? I mean, it's really got to work 100% of the time, or 99.9% of the time. So they brought us in to do the work to fix their botched implementation. So we took a look at it, and again, there was no documentation. Nobody understood the decisions that were made and why they were made. And we pretty much had to scrap it and start from scratch, putting in the appropriate workflows. And with the issues that we ran into were that there were a lot of conditionals, that sometimes these invoices would come in with the tax lines on them. Sometimes they didn't. And before, what was happening is that the software is supposed to match the invoice number and the dollar amount, and it wasn't because of those things. So we had to have all this conditional logic, well, as if you don't find it, do this, then do this, then do this. If it fails, then do that. So there was a pretty complex workflow, but we could stick all of that workflow right into Boomi. So when you go into the integration, you click on it, you got these nice, well-documented blocks. We put comments in there. We built a really nice set of documentation that we gave the client that kind of says, here's the workflow, here's why, here are the use cases that we used. And we kind of really laid all those integrations out. So in the future, if they need to go somewhere else, they have all that documentation. If they want to work on it themselves, they have all that documentation. But what they ended up doing is wanting us to do 4 more integrations for that because we did such a good job. The being able to build these things out seamlessly with the right documentation and the right understanding is huge. Is huge. The one side had the invoicing software package had a connector that we could use, but on the outside we had to build our own connectors. Now we did another project for a company that moved to Salesforce, and we had to grab all of their sales data and stick it into Salesforce, and they were moving from JD Edwards to NetSuite. So we built that. We built the integration. We custom built the JD Edwards side, which was fairly easy because it was just a data table read, and pushed it into Salesforce. And then when they went to NetSuite, we were just able to change the one side. Instead of getting the sales data from JD Edwards, we got it from NetSuite. And we didn't have to really redo much of the connection to Salesforce at all. I mean, I would say that it was a third of the time just to swap it. So when you have things like that, it makes it a lot easier for you to go and change software if you want to. If you feel that your invoicing software isn't good, or your HR software isn't any good, or whatever, you can swap it out on one end, do all the mapping and integration inside of Boomi or whatever IPAS software you're using, and it will automatically flow, and you don't have to touch the other side. So that's Boomi. And then we'll talk about the last one, which is an enterprise service bus. And as you can tell by this graphic, it is very, very powerful, but a lot more complex. The way a enterprise service bus works is that you have a bus, and let's think of it as a highway. And your software will drop a message on this bus on the highway, and you have all the other systems listening for that message and deal with it. So let's say you made a sale and you wanted to let people know that you made the sale. You have one system that handles inventory, one system that handles something like commissions, and then your financials. And all three of them need to be notified of that, and they need to do different things based upon that message. So if you use an enterprise service bus, you drop that message in the message queue, and you have programmed those systems to say, okay, this is a message I care about, ignore all the others. And it will grab that message, then it will process it, and then if it fails, you can have it kicked back out into the bus, and you can notify someone, they can fix it, and then it'll go through. We used MuleSoft is the enterprise service bus that we've used in the past. They're I think they're owned by Salesforce now. So what's nice is that you have the queue in there, and these are all considered guaranteed receipt, which means that the messages will get through. Like there is no fail. If it fails, it stays in the queue till you deal with it, and then you can have. It's a lot easier to do load balancing with it. It's got very good security. You can do data encryption and multiple layers. It's built security first framework. and again, because you are updating items in the queue and you drop it in the queue, it can update things simultaneously, and it scales really well. If you got 1,000, then you get up to 20,000, you'll be able to handle all those transactions. And it's similar to the IPAS ones like Boomi, where you build these data blocks that do your integration. It has all those features as well, but it brings in the whole concept of data bus and built-in security. And what could happen? It's less likely that it's going to freeze, but sometimes these systems do. Sometimes the performance gets reduced based upon how your network is built out, and it's expensive. It's more expensive than something like a Boomi or any of the other IPAS software packages. So we did one about 3 years ago for a Verizon partner that sold cell phones, and we needed it. They purchased a point of sale software package that could drop these messages in the queue, and we had to update JD Edwards when a sale was made. There was a commission software package that we had to use. It was a system that did inventory that needed to get updated. So we ran through all of those software packages by putting it into the queue. And we're talking thousands of stores. So there was a lot of data that was going through the system, and we eventually got it to work. There was a third party that was doing the MuleSoft work for us, and they ended up really not knowing what they were doing. So when we had our first stress test, it ground everything to a halt because they weren't using the software correctly. So we had to go through and reanalyze how they're doing it and get another vendor in to help us with learning the MuleSoft software package. And we kind of finally brought it across the finish line. Out of all the integration I've done, it is the slickest and the most painful. If you're an enterprise, if you're $1 billion enterprise or 700 million, yeah, that makes a lot of sense for you to look at something like enterprise service bus. And if you're a company that's got over $1 billion, it really makes a lot more sense. Just because at that point you've got so many systems that you want to have, and you may have subsidiaries that may be on different ERP systems, and you want to line up all your financials in one center of truth. Like if you want it all to go to Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or whatever SAP, whatever you need to use as your financial software package, something like an enterprise service bus can be super helpful in integrating all of that. But you would have to have a pretty decent sized team to do that. And but at that point, you're going to make sure that your integrations don't fail. All right, so that's about it for me. If there's any questions, you can post them, and I'll turn this back over to Mike.
Thank you, Stephen. I've got a couple questions came in, like, what would you tell a prospect coming to you about, look, I'm not as much worried about now, but in 5 years, if they just met you in an elevator, or, they were in a seminar and heard you speak and said, what should I be looking at? I'm moving to the, I've pretty much moved everything to the cloud. We just got done with that. I mean, is there something that the way the technology in the market is moving, that is, you would say you need to lean on a certain style of integration? You're going to need to look at that in the next few years. I mean, kind of what's on the horizon, would you say, for firms that have now moved to the cloud or are completely moving to the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I think that IPAS and enterprise service buses are going to be the wave of the future. The larger and larger software companies are building these connectors, and that just makes your life a lot easier. IPAS is all in the cloud itself, so that's kind of the I think the wave of the future.
All right, and we do have a survey at the end of this, and if you complete the survey, you can you're entered to win a Amazon card. So I do want to make sure we do that. Another question we had is, just what are some do you find when you're presented with a problem, you kind of know what to do right away, or does it really take a lot of of work to do this, or is it pretty big? Maybe is there a common thread of mistakes that companies tend to make that tend to get them into integration issues that almost always kind of come up? Like, there's one strategy or one thing that you could get companies not to do, because not everybody can have a team of integration experts, certainly.
No, right. I mean,
yeah,
it happens fairly often, is not doing your homework up front. A lot of these things need to be handled. Your data, you understand what your integrations are going to do. Make sure that the two vendors understand how they're going to communicate, and you got to be prepared. We did another big integration project where we brought in PwC, and those guys didn't understand the software that they were doing, and we had to redo our point-to-point integrations 3 times because they didn't understand how the data needed to be presented in their software package and how it needed to get returned. So being prepared, understanding the APIs from both sides helps. Now, a lot of that goes away when you go into IPAS, because and even MuleSoft, because they have connectors that you don't have. The connectors are kind of laid out for you, so it's not as difficult.
Gotcha. We did get a question in from Tom. Many of the public cloud providers, Azure, AWS, et cetera, deploy cloud bases, integration services, e.g. Azure Service Bus, PubSub. What is your take on leveraging these services along with your IPAS ESB? We are looking to do this with our IPAS from Informatica.
Yeah, what one of our vendors uses Informatica, which is a good software package. But we haven't used it. But understanding that each one of these are slightly different, you have to kind of dive deep into how you want it to be laid out, if it's going to meet your requirements. Any of the other, we've used Azure Service Bus. We have a product called Genius that my team has developed that maintains JD Edwards infrastructure, and we use the Azure Service Bus to communicate data back and forth to our central hub for reporting. That has its hiccups in it too, but again, it all depends on how much traffic you're running through it. Our service bus bill is kind of expensive, but it's a decent piece of software. Again, it's getting the right tool for the right project. There's no simple answer saying, you should buy a Chrysler or you should buy this. You got to figure out what you're trying to get accomplished, and then look at the software package to make sure that's going to meet your needs.
See, you learn something every day. I didn't know Chrysler was in integration platforms. So just kidding. I know what you're talking about.
They are.
Speaking of your team, how many people are we talking about on the GSI team? Because I know you rely on some in Brazil and in Ukraine and in different parts of the world. I mean, when we say GSI is global, we're global partly because of the people on your team. And just maybe, is there an expertise, like, just kind of tell me just a minute about the team that you rely on to pull this stuff off, because they've done stuff with virtual as well, but go ahead.
Yeah. So we got the right shore approach where we have consultants that are stateside, because there's certain customers that require all the developers to be stateside. We have a team in India, we have a team in Brazil, and we have a team in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians we use them specifically for actual custom application development. The team in Brazil we use for building out our web services. They're the ones that are doing the point-to-point integration with Swagger. We have a group here on the States that also do system integration. So we're super flexible, not only in our staffing, because I think we're about 12 people now, but we can increase it, and the prices for these consultants vary depending upon where we're doing the work, so we can be very cost competitive at the same time.
Great. Well, I will, we're going to go ahead and if you have some additional questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. I did want to make sure everyone was aware that GSI provides extensive free educational resources, including weekly educational webcasts like this. So everyone, if you came in late or you want to share this webcast with somebody, I know there's a few people here at GSI who requested the video to this. We will be posting it within about 24 hours. It'll be on our website. Monthly newsletter called the GSI Insider. We have a YouTube channel, as well as conferences, events, regional user groups. And you can find this up on our website, getgsi.com. This is just showing the JD Edwards path, but there's different sections we've got. And obviously on social media, you can find us on GSI Inc. I'd say LinkedIn is kind of and Facebook are the ones we use, as well as YouTube. We've got tons of resources there. So, and I have provided a link in the chat. Whoops, it's a survey, and if you complete the survey, you're entered to win a $25 gift card. Not just among everybody who's ever entered a survey, just the basically 10 of you here. So you have a 1 in 10 chance of winning a gift card if you do that. We've gotten to the Q&A, and that's really it. So. Thank you everyone for joining us. Steve, of course, thank you.